Welcome back to the Land Matters podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Well, it's been several weeks since the conclusion of the COP28 Global Climate Summit, which took place in Dubai in December. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. 195 countries, all bringing negotiators, 150 heads of state, total of 85,000 participants. It's a big deal. And here at the Lincoln Institute, we think it's worth taking some time to let things sink in and reflect on the path forward for confronting climate change. So in a moment, we're going to have a roundtable discussion with 4 people from our organization who were there. But first, a little background and context. The agreement at the close of COP28 that got the most attention was a commitment for all nations to be focused on transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. Many had hoped for stronger language calling for the phasing out of oil and gas on a stricter timetable, and of course there was the fact that the summit itself was hosted by a region whose economy is fundamentally based on extracting and exporting fossil fuels. But it was the first time a COP declaration has specifically identified fossil fuels. The Dubai meeting also ended with an appeal to triple renewable energy capacity and combat methane emissions, a goal to halt deforestation by 2030, and an outline for a loss and damage fund. All of that could be fairly characterized as progress in the face of a planetary emergency, but still, 2023 was the hottest year on record, and current emissions are on track for a world that is 2.5 degrees warmer, well above the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal set at the Paris Accords, the major international agreement to come out of the COP21 summit in 2015. Missing that target has contributed to more skepticism about COP and the pledges and non-binding declarations that have followed, including some dashed hopes after COP26 in Glasgow 2 years ago. So are these big summits what the world should be looking to? Are they designed to accomplish anything more than to keep the parties talking, taking stock, and keeping score on commitments? To break all this down, we're joined by those 4 people from the Lincoln Institute who were in Dubai. Amy Cotter and Patrick Welch from the Climate Strategies team, Anna Claudia Rosbach, who runs the Latin America program, and John Farner, the director of the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy.
Let me gather your reflections about COP28. What was the mood like? What were others saying and thinking about the value of this exercise at this point? Start with a few reflections, if you will, about the commitment, such as it was, to transition away from fossil fuels. Amy Cotter, can you take that first one?
Sure. I think that the mood at the COP venue in Dubai reflected the roller coaster related to that commitment, such that it is. And I think that there was a tremendous amount of excitement, that overt conversation about the role of fossil fuels in climate change was part of the dialogue, and that at one point it appeared that the world's leaders were poised to make genuine commitments to shift away from fossil fuel sources of energy. But then that quickly hit. The roller coaster went down, I suppose, when that commitment became so caveated and moderated as to be really a suggestion. So, I think while there is a great deal of credit to be given for having that overt conversation and seeing the words fossil fuels related to our progress reducing climate change in the final document, I think that generally speaking, people would have liked to have seen that in the document about a decade or more ago. And I fear too little, too late is the prevailing conclusion among advocates for concrete, sufficient climate action.
Okay, others? Patrick?
Yeah, I agree with Amy that if too little, too late, I think sums it up very nicely. One thing that I've tried to do is think about that announcement in the context of the broader UNFCCC process, and that 28 plus events have happened already, and this was the first time that fossil fuels were explicitly mentioned. So it may not be the best process to tackle this really urgent crisis that is the climate change, but it is an ongoing process. And thinking about the fact that transitioning away from fossil fuels was included in the final decision and what the parties are to be doing over this next year, which is revamping more ambitious climate action plans and NDCs, the fact that they can point back to transitioning away from fossil fuels as something agreed upon by 200 parties, I think will matter and will make those updated NDCs stronger, or at least stronger than if the fossil fuel language hadn't been there.
And just to remind us, the NDCs
are the nationally determined contributions, and new ones are due in about a year.
All right. Well, that was a lot of the headlines, but I think in this conversation, we're going to end up looking at what else went on at COP28 of value. And apparently, there was some good discussions about methane and public health, but we also want to explore what other areas got some good discussion and what partnerships or other commitments might have flowed from that. So let's turn to our thing at the Lincoln Institute, and that's the role of land and land use. This is for anyone to jump in and frame the context about land use and its role in climate action.
If I can jump in and try to do that in two respects. I think that land use, which represents the ways in which society chooses to use its land, let's be clear, these are choices. I think that at this COP, I saw an increased understanding that these are choices we're making and that almost all of the mitigation strategies discussed by parties commit land to some use or another at some time frame in the future or another. And in fact, that commitment of land to different mitigation functions, or we see, of course, the role of land in helping populations, whether they're human or otherwise, to adapt to the inevitable degree of climate change. Land is implicated in all of those solution sets, to the extent that there is probably more land committed in models, in plans for mitigation and adaptation than there is land on this earth. And the increasing demand for land to be used for one purpose or another, it's starting to enter the dialogue that this is not a sustainable solution in and of itself, and that there are important choices and conversations to be had as we prioritize the uses of land in different settings. The second fashion in which I'll describe the role of land in these conversations is in a really exciting, renewed attention to the alignment across levels of government in their efforts to tackle climate change. We know, regardless of centralized government or decentralized government, a lot of land use decisions are made at a local level. That's really where land use has to work for people and ecosystems and places. With the new announcement of the CHAMP initiative, I think you see, again, an acknowledgement of the need to align across levels of government, particularly when it comes to questions of urban form, urban development, land use, water use, alignment across levels of government, and a commitment by some 70 countries to doing that, including the United States. And because much of our work focuses on changes that need to be made at that local level in terms of land use, and because in many cases, those subnational city, state, province, what have you levels are more aware of the negative impacts of climate change and have a stronger motivation to act quickly than do their national level of government. I think that's an exciting elevation of the role of cities and other subnational governments in this dialogue.
And just remind us, what is CHAMP?
CHAMP is indeed an acronym, the Coalition for High Ambition Multi-Level Partnerships for Climate Action, an effort to explicitly include cities and regions in the design of federal climate commitments and strategies.
All right, so it sounds like that in itself, and Ana Claudia, you might jump in here, sort of codifying or formalizing those partnerships. Sounds like it was especially valuable this time around.
Yeah, I believe there is a strong role for non-governmental organizations or subnational level governments to act during the COP between COPs, right? So at one level, you see the negotiations among member states, national governments. They, of course, are limited considering, the cultural environment or context we live in. more political support governments receive towards action, more active they will be. So it's very relevant to me that other stakeholders also work in alignment, in partnership, in association to build this narrative around the importance of cities, the importance of local action, right? And then if you look at our core work, to understand how important is land, the use, especially of urban land in this context. Remembering that we are living in a context of highly urbanized world. The prediction for 2050 is that 70% of the population live in cities. So how these cities are prepared to accommodate all inhabitants living and to come and that are moving between cities, different regions, different countries is essential in this battle around climate change. I've seen the presence of local governments improving throughout the COP, throughout these conversations. CHAMP is a realization of that because it's not only an agreement among local governments, but it's a recognition of the relevance and importance of multi-level action. And also another interesting feature of COP28 is that it hosted the second interministerial meeting in dealing with urban issues. So the importance, the relevance of cities has been, increasing throughout the COPs. And this is where I think we have a good opportunity and a good niche to think about and to act upon the ecological function of land.
Anthony, if I could jump in here really quick and respond to Anna Claudia and Amy's assessment, not only outlining our reaction to the fossil fuel commitment, but then also the inclusion of the land use, urbanization discussion that went on at the COP. I don't want to take any of this for granted. It is very easy for the global discussion and the national discussions within each country to focus primarily on issues like fossil fuel production and reliance on fossil fuels, methane gas emissions. These are all very easy, and that's what the general population hear about coming out of these global COP discussions. When you're at the COP, it is not a given that urban issues affecting land and land policy are being given the time that they deserve, or the level of deservedness that these issues have, and the reliance on the global climate discussion has on land issues, and how the global conversation on climate affects land issues. So I don't want to take this for granted that what Anna Claudia, Amy, and Patrick have laid out during the discussion is actually very positive. The fact that we have a ministerial discussion on urbanization and the role of urban areas in climate is a huge path forward, and it's going to lay the groundwork for not only future COPs, but also countries' commitments and country implementation on the ground.
Could I add one thing? Thinking about the recognition of urbanization and land use in these discussions, in addition to all of the other topics that you saw present at COP, to me speaks to the role that COP overall is playing. Yes, there's the negotiation side, and then there's what's become a much larger, almost trade show of hundreds of pavilions, thousands of participants that aren't engaged directly in negotiations. And I asked several people while in Dubai, has this become too much? What is this achieving? And I think what John just mentioned is one of the key outcomes and really highlights the importance to maintain this global spotlight on this event and to engage as many participants as possible, because you start to bring in all of these other very relevant, very deserving perspectives in a way that you can hopefully lead to more effective solutions and more effective negotiations that reflect the diverse attendance.
That provides what may seem to be a mood, a sense of hot topics aside from negotiations, but it places real pressure on the negotiators themselves. If the dialogue in the conference outside the negotiations is related to critical issues that are not even present in the negotiations themselves, it sort of calls into relief the seriousness or lack thereof with which those negotiators are treating the commitments they're making. I do think that the presence of civil society and others outside the negotiations themselves were part of the reason the outcome around fossil fuels was as significant as it was in the end. Earlier drafts were not quite so serious.
If I might add, I would say not only pressure, but also sometimes inspiration, because sometimes we think about these negotiators like semi-gods who knows all the answers. And these delegations are not composed of one or two persons. They are big. And you have members of these delegations going out of the negotiation rooms, talking to people, interacting, learning these different perspectives that Patrick was talking about, right? From different sectors. Usually the negotiators are people dealing strictly with a vision that's limited of climate change, and they start to understand the interrelations with other aspects. So how it is interconnected with something like urban planning, for example, right? Even for us, it's something that we are discovering, we are understanding more day by day, or the realities faced by many cities and countries in the global south. We are all aware about the housing crisis, but how it is affecting and exacerbated by the climate change in the global south, if people don't see, people lose connection to that.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that in housing global south. Can any of you be more specific about how this sort of filters down to the level of housing and human settlement in cities, and how we can possibly sort of juggle or hold these different elements together of climate action and housing these millions of people living in cities?
Yeah, I think we are facing a dichotomy here because at one hand, we see cities growing. So it's a fact that we are expanding the consumption of land more than we grow as population. It's a fact that all countries are facing a housing crisis. So you see homelessness, you see migrants, refugees, a housing crisis, you see the poverty, both extremely in the global south with informal settlements, slums, and so on, but also informality growing in countries from the global north as well. We see the gap, the major gap that we have between income, levels of income and price of houses. So this is affecting all of us. And we see that we are consuming more land. So how can we use land policies? How can we think smartly about land tools, land instruments, as solutions, as ways for us to tackle that? We need to maximize the use of the building environment. Otherwise, we will need to build more houses and impact the environment. If we don't deal properly with land expansion, we will need more infrastructure. It's also more expensive for cities. In the global south, you have large portion of the population. We talk about 1 billion people living in slum conditions, but we also talk about 2 billion people without access to water. So we have billions of people in the world, living in very high vulnerable areas and situations of precarity. They are suffering more from climate change. So we really need to think how smartly we can use land policy, to overcome these inequalities, the social gaps that we have, and simultaneously address climate change. I think it's possible. I think we need to think smart. We need to be inspired. We need to get pressure, all of things that we discussed, right, to understand the best approaches for us to raise awareness and to act upon it.
And if I may, I think Ana Claudia is absolutely right. And she's highlighting the ways in which housing policy, in which infrastructure policy is climate policy. And there may well be ways that we can address the most vulnerable in our communities through providing services to informal settlements or otherwise increasing our housing demand that does so in a fashion that not only reduces that vulnerability to the effects of climate change for a critical population, but also reduces the building energy consumed by units of housing at the periphery, adds to the transportation emissions that they create. So how can we address the conditions in which 1 billion or 2 people find themselves and do so in a fashion that reduces the magnitude of climate change, which in turn would put even more people at risk?
There's a lot of things connected here, and it's actually an interesting exercise, isn't it, to hold all these different elements and try to address them without sort of getting overwhelmed. Is that ever a danger in any of your views?
I think one danger is not approaching these issues with a systems lens. And I think that's the really critical thing that's at the core of land policy, is that it's rooted in land systems and it's inherently systemic. I think we've seen a lot of the traditional approaches to climate change, housing issues, conservation to be very siloed, very sectoral in their approach and very sectoral in the solutions. And one thing that I was really inspired by a lot of the conversations happening at COP related to land policy, because they were often, whether explicitly mentioned or not, the way in which community leaders, mayors, national government officials were speaking about how they were leveraging land policy in the context of climate change, it was all about the multi-benefit solutions that were offered. So we heard people talking about how land policy is critical to bring nature back into the city, nature-based solutions, improve resilience while increasing biodiversity. Heard people talking about the role of land policy in, as Anna Claudia was mentioning, upgrading informal settlements, providing more affordable housing in the global south, while also being responsive to climate impacts. It can be very overwhelming to try to address everything everywhere all at once. But I think when you start to think about the role land policy can play, it becomes a lot easier to approach these solutions more systematically.
John Furner, I want to turn to you. Let's add two more elements. Water and I dare say agriculture. Was there any progress that you saw on those issues and how water as a resource fits into this discussion of climate action?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Anthony. And I find the way the question was framed also interesting because for those who don't know, annual COP conferences, the COP meetings, last for approximately 2 weeks. So it's a pretty long time to be there. In some cases, negotiations take the whole 2 weeks. Sometimes they take more. Sometimes they take less. This one trended towards the more side. Within those 2 weeks, you have thematic days. So each day, the negotiators, the parties, the observers, they all recognize different elements of climate policy and climate action throughout the COP. This year, water and agriculture had the same thematic day. It was actually the very last thematic day that was recognized during the COP, I think it was day 12, was for water and agriculture. So in the eyes of the United Nations and the Conference on Parties, they recognize the interconnectivity of water and agriculture given the amount of water that is used by agriculture each and every day globally. Now, with that said, we just talked about how some things can be overwhelming. You have too many issues that are on the table, and sometimes it diverts attention from one to the other. And I would caution against that as well. It's important that we take everything and view this from a systematic approach. So I agree with that completely. And sometimes there's also unintended consequences that need to be taken into consideration as well. How does climate policy affect water accessibility, affect water management, or affect land use policy, and vice versa? So I think it's important to insert whatever other issue that is out there that the climate discussions encompass, biodiversity, et cetera. So what are those unintended consequences? What are those intended outcomes that exist and how they interconnect with one another? Now, with water and agriculture being together, given the global need for agricultural production, our food, feed, fuel, and fiber, it's only natural that agriculture, let's say, eats up a lot of time and energy during that day outside of water. Now, water can be a part of that, but a lot of times what is lost is for sanitation and health. And so you have water management and you have how climate is affecting water availability and water accessibility, extreme droughts, extreme rain events. Areas of the globe are getting more water than they're used to. Areas are getting less. Some are getting the same, but in different times of the year and months, where if you're getting, in United States imperial terms, if you're getting 10 inches of rain, a year, those 10 inches may occur within 2 months of the year, and then 10 months you're getting next to nothing. And so where it's not spread out. So water is affected by climate policy. Climate policy affects water, access, sanitation, and health, and availability for whatever uses that can be. Now, the good news is that we are coming off of a water conference, United Nations Water Conference, that occurred in March of 2023, the first one since 1977, and have themes and commitments that transcend into other global discussions, including those at COP. So we just talked about commitments from the climate perspective. There are also commitments on the water perspective as well that are intertwined with one another. And now I see a real commitment from the United Nations member countries, the United Nations itself, non-government organizations, the observers, all of the stakeholders really making a commitment to move forward the importance of water when it comes into these climate discussions. So to your point and question, Anthony, I am excited about the increased discussion and focus on water specifically throughout this COP. It's important for a resilient city to occur. To be successful, we need to have a water plan and succinct water management associated to be a resilient city. To have strong land use planning, there needs to be water planning associated with that. It's a core function of the Babbitt Center, and it's now intertwined throughout the initiatives at the Lincoln Institute. And we're seeing that more and more on the climate discussions as well. Not only how do you manage water, but how are these decisions and discussions that are occurring affect water, access, sanitation, and health? How does it affect agricultural production? How does it affect city resilience? And how do these discussions that are happening on the ground affect the overall climate discussions as well? I'm encouraged by the discussions. I feel like the Lincoln Institute, those of us that are part of this roundtable, really were a part of advancing that discussion. And I commend all of my global colleagues and friends who are also part of these discussions as well to advance water as part of these global climate discussions.
I was really pleased to be on a panel with you, John, and a cast of characters that brought that perspective to the table, including Hank Ovink, who chaired, I believe, that conference on water that you mentioned, and who talked about how he treats the IPCC Special Report on Land really as a manual, a Bible, maybe a little strong, for how you think about the relationship of water and land in an integrative fashion across all of these issues. We had representatives from Latin America, from the Middle East, North Africa region, and from the United States on that panel. And it really highlighted the ways in which each and every of those geographies, with their different manifestations of climate change, are all tackling those questions with the same understanding of the interrelationships and the need to consider water, agriculture, food security, security of tenure and shelter for everybody, regardless of their context.
Yeah, and Amy is absolutely right. And we're looking at it from developing nations, developed nations, indigenous lands. And that's one aspect we didn't even touch on during our discussion is the indigenous population and the increased voice that the tribal nations and indigenous populations have during these COPs. Each one I've been to, it seems that more and more emphasis and focus and the rightful voice of these nations, these First Nations, have an increased voice at these discussions. When it comes to water, it's absolutely right. And where access to water for sanitation and health is number one priority, the only priority for many of the developing nations and a lot of the underserved populations of developed nations. And others, it may be how do we advance our economy through agricultural production while keeping in mind the environmental impact agricultural production has on these lands and our overall ecosystem surrounding where these crops are being grown. So I agree completely with that assessment.
And, if I may take the risk of speaking about the experience that nation states, people in Africa are having, we're talking about some of the feedback loops that create incentives for fossil fuel production, for example. In Africa, where there's a fair amount of untapped fossil fuel resources, of course, it's in the interests of nations to look for opportunities to sell that resource in order to meet the needs of their population for sanitation, for example, or for clean water. In those arid, rapidly growing places where the health and safety of people is, of course, a paramount concern. And if the world writ large wants to find alternatives to fossil fuels, it needs to help nation states that have populations in dire need meet their needs without having to tap into the fossil fuel reserves that I think collectively we would all like to see remain underground.
Now, I wanted to complement this discussion, highlighting one feature from the COP that I thought was very interesting. For many events, especially for the official side events, the combinations of the discussions were very unexpected. So because there's a high demand to present, to host side events, what the organizers do is they merge different organizations and they try to merge teams and so on. So me, for example, I ended up in a panel that merged two discussions, one around energy and the other one around transportation. And they invited me to talk about land and housing and the role of urban planning and all of that. And the discussion rounded up nicely. It was a nice discussion. So sometimes, we think it's very complicated to go beyond our silos, but maybe it's simpler than we think it is. And maybe it's our job to go through the complexities and then extract from these complexities the simplicity of messages that should come across the broader public, because this is our responsibility. And I would agree with everybody else before that it's a relevant moment for the society. When COP takes place, the media is around COP, everybody's around COP. So it's a moment, to stop and to think about that and to raise awareness and to find these messages that will help these leaders and the key stakeholders to move on and to receive the political support for that.
Well, we're coming up to time, so how about some final thoughts? Speaking of time, we all know we're in a race against time in terms of trying to keep the planet habitable and under 2 degrees Celsius towards the end of this century. What sustains, as final thoughts, what sustains your optimism or not?
I think we are slightly changing how we do things. That's what I perceive, throughout these COPs. And the presence of more and more stakeholders, their acknowledgement is a recognition of the importance of collective action, is a recognition that the answer lies not in a single organization, but throughout the different sectors, public, private, social, academia, and so on. We have different paces as professionals, institutions, we have different perspectives. It's just through networks, communities of practice, collective, that will be able to build critical mass, find some consensus, what is the long-term path, what's the short-term. But we are recognizing that we cannot wait until all the answers can be answered through, the traditional methods that we had before, like doing research and finding all the data and so on, because the time is running, right? So I will repeat what I said before earlier today. I think we should trust our brains to give us answers to complex problems we face as humanity. So we have to trust ourselves, and the collective to process the research, the experience that we have available, to create this understanding, the possible pathways, and the immediate solutions that we can use to take action right now. So I'm optimistic.
I think what gives me optimism isn't the milestones and the announcements at each COP, but it's the stories and the action that you see taking place on the ground. Through all the side events and the presentations, each one is a story of success on the ground and action being taken on the ground. And I think that's what continues to give me hope rather than the announcements that get most of the attention at COP.
I'll chime in there, Patrick. Some of the solutions that our world faces are going to be very difficult. Phasing out of fossil fuels is not an easy task. The reliance on fossil fuels that developed and developing countries have is real and significant. And we cannot snap our fingers and just say we are going to transition away tomorrow. It needs to be thoughtful. It needs to be purposeful. It needs to have an alternative solution embedded and ready to go that does not negatively impact any other parts of our society. That is very difficult to do, and I think the discussions are going in the right direction. However, there are a lot of solutions out there that are, quite frankly, a lot easier. And so the examples that Patrick just gave of these discussions highlighting a lot of on-the-ground solutions that are being implemented and nations are committed to do on a short-term, not a long-term basis, are real, and they're here. I talked about some things with water. There are a lot that we are doing. There is a lot we are doing. We, as in the multi-levels of government, are implementing throughout the world that have a positive impact on water and, by association, climate. So that gives me a lot of ease, a lot of great thoughts about the future, knowing that through these small steps, we can achieve greater accomplishments with end goals in sight of issues like the significant reduction of methane gas emissions, like our elimination of the reliance on fossil fuel production and usage. So this is something I think we're going in the right direction, and it gives me a lot of hope and pleasure in that thought process.
building on what my colleagues have said, I gain a lot of encouragement from the prevailing understanding that these are systems and we can't seek a single silver bullet solution, but rather we must embrace a multiplicity of solutions across different levels of government. Context sensitive, but there's both no time to waste and no single solution. And the recognition of that, I hope, will break through analysis paralysis and finger pointing that creates a sense that it's somebody else's problem and responsibility. There's something each and every one of us can do. And it's not always about embracing personal deprivation either. You can have a high quality of life and still reduce your climate impact. Finally, I am greatly encouraged by the role of, dare I say, young people, youth. We're very present at COP, very present at discussions across the board. Many people under 20, under 30 have never lived at a time that wasn't threatened by climate change. It's defining and a huge threat to their future and their prosperity. And even as I feel, frankly, shameful at the role I may have played as somebody who's well above that age to creating that future for them, I greatly admire their ability, their effectiveness to speak their mind and hold centers of power responsible for the world they're creating. It's a short matter of time before people in their 20s and 30s are in positions of power, poised to make different decisions about our paths forward. And I look forward to that.
Well, Patrick Welsh, Anna Claudia Rosbach, John Farner, and Amy Cotter, thank you for joining this conversation on Land Matters.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is it for this episode of Land Matters, the first episode of our 5th season, by the way, so a little cause for celebration. We'll keep at it as long as you keep listening, so don't forget to rate, subscribe, and refer this podcast to anyone interested in cities and the future of the environment. You can learn more about our climate action agenda by going to the website lincolnitz.edu and also follow us on social media. The handle is @LandPolicy. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Always good to be with you. On behalf of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, thanks for listening.